What is enlightenment? One of the most persistent concepts in the human experience is the insistence of a divine reality. Arguably, we hadn't fully evolved before this concept made us into the religious ape that we call humans today. This concept has persisted since the beginning because of an unbroken chain of people who have had indescribable spiritual experiences that made them insistent of its reality, regardless of the fact that the vast majority of people never glimpse it. These mystics and sages express these ineffable concepts into mythologies to make them relatable to human experience and comprehension. The unenlightened masses, however, come to believe or disbelieve that the stories are real, without ever fully grasping the esoteric wisdom which they contain, but cannot be directly expressed. So, what is this enlightenment, and how do we achieve it? Simply put, enlightenment is the realization of aspects of reality which we did not previously perceive. And there are many stages of this process, which is actually the evolution of your own consciousness. In the early stages of enlightenment, the biggest revelations are the realizations of the simplest things. In fact, one of the first steps of enlightenment is simply the realization that I am. This is something you always thought you knew, but never truly realized. This seemingly simple realization literally turns on the light bulb, and many describe it as waking up. There's a distinct awareness of how actually unaware you had previously been throughout your life, like you're on autopilot. Now, there's a difference between understanding something conceptually and realizing it. This is why you always knew you existed, but until you realize it, you aren't so absolutely amazed by it that you can't stop staring at your own hands. A blind scientist who studies vision can learn everything ever learned about eyes and optical sight, but without experiencing it directly, they can never truly realize what it is. The ability to perceive these aspects of reality that most people cannot perceive has been called gnosis. Gnosis is the awareness of esoteric meaning and understanding that most people are not perceiving. When the disciples of Jesus asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" he replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see, and though hearing, they do not hear or understand." Understanding is the goal. The highest form of intelligence and evolution is humor. Humans are unique among animals in that we experience laughter as an expression of humor. If someone tells you a joke, you won't laugh unless you get the joke. We find the understanding of the joke funny and express it by laughter. This is also why people laugh uncontrollably when they take psychedelic drugs. Even if they're unable to verbally express what they are realizing, the realization itself is hilarious. This is also why it's all a big cosmic joke from the perspective of the Most High. The higher our perspective, the more of the picture we can see, and the more we understand how and why it is. One of the transcendental enlightening experiences that we can reliably induce is called samadhi. Samadhi is a word from Hindu and Buddhist traditions, which means to become one. In this state of consciousness, the boundaries that separate you and everything else dissolve. We can experience being everybody at the same time, or even being the entire universe itself. This experience can supposedly be induced through years of intense, dedicated practice to meditation, and those who accomplish it are often regarded as saints. But it's an experience that's open to all of us, and it's one of the most common experiences that we can reliably induce with psychedelic sacraments. It's a common experience on psychedelics to sit down on a couch and then lose your sense of where you end and the couch begins. All of a sudden you are the couch as you slowly become more and more one with your environment. This experience of standing outside yourself is called ecstasis in the Greek. Ecstatic spiritual experience is the path to exploring the realms above the physical plane for deeper understanding and enlightenment. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was written by Egyptian priests over 1,000 years, and it was a roadmap of the journey into the Duat, or the afterlife. It was a funerary text that would be recited over a dead body to help the soul navigate the spheres beyond the physical plane. In 1964, Harvard psychologists were studying LSD. Timothy Leary and his partner Richard Alpert, who later became Baba Ram Dass, realized that the Book of the Dead accurately described the ascension process that leads to psychedelic ego death. They would take heroic doses of LSD, one at a time, while the other would read the Book of the Dead to them. This would help them navigate the higher realms of consciousness and ascend to higher and higher spheres. The goal was ultimately to surrender to death, which results in being born again into the same body since it hasn't expired yet, allowing us to return with the awareness of what happens when we die. The Book of the Dead provided a framework through which to understand the psychedelic experience. This correlation between enlightenment and medicine, or sacrament to induce enlightenment as symbolized by a serpent, is universal in religious context and remains the symbol for medicine to this day. The Egyptian god Thoth is both the god of wisdom and healing. Here he can be seen feeding an ankh, which means life, to a pharaoh. He carries a staff entwined with snakes. Asclepius was the Greek god of medicine. Mythology says a serpent licked his ears and taught him wisdom and resurrection. He carries a staff entwined by serpents. The Greek god Hermes was the messenger god and brought divine wisdom to humans. He also carries a staff entwined by serpents. Even in the biblical texts, it's a serpent who tempts Eve with a magical fruit that makes one wise and opens their eyes to divine wisdom, albeit at the cost of death. And there are many more verses whose esoteric meaning is unheard by most who hear them. For example, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And this bread, which I will give for the life of the world, is my flesh. Truly I say to you, that unless you eat the flesh and blood of God, ye shall have no life in you. Ye seek me not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves, and ye were filled. Can there be any doubt that these are psychedelic metaphors? Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds pretty crazy. And it wouldn't be possible to discuss enlightenment without talking about insanity. You can think of enlightenment as the fine line between genius and insanity. In mathematics, the line is called phi. Everything in nature strives to touch this line, and this is something we'll talk about more in other videos. A true seeker will straddle the line in order to best define its boundaries. It can be difficult to make it through this process without completely losing our minds. The only difference between genius and insanity is the ability to eloquently express the information coming in. If the human vessel becomes overwhelmed by the information it's processing, the bodily machine will short-circuit in a way that we call insanity. Consider how similar someone looks in the throes of a psychedelic visionary experience and a person experiencing psychosis. For example, what is the difference between this and this? Or consider the difference between this, which is called stimming and is common in autistic people, and this, which has been called mudra and is the spontaneous movements that are the result of transcendent psychedelic visionary states of consciousness. The only difference between these things is the ability for the human body to articulate the energy eloquently. Furthermore, this suggests that these practices have been handed down for thousands of years from sages who exhibited them spontaneously in visionary states, and have since been imitated over time until today, when people still practice the action without any awareness of its origin. Children who are born into tribal societies and who exhibit traits such as talking to imaginary friends or recalling past lives are sent to the shaman's hut, where they learn to navigate these energies in productive and positive ways. They grow up to be shaman who intercede on behalf of men in the spiritual realm. they become important members of society, and they're given a positive framework through which to navigate their extrasensory experiences. Contrast that with our modern society that classifies these traits as psychosis and medicates away any chance of developing these spiritual awarenesses, and further implants the idea that there's something bad and wrong with these children, which further exacerbates the manifestation of negative as opposed to positive psychic experiences. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded analytical psychology. He was a colleague of Freud, and Freud considered him the heir to his new Freudian psychological science, but the approach between these two men would ultimately drive them apart. See, Freud was using the arguably lower vibrational drug cocaine to fuel his intellect. He expressed the concepts of the unconscious mind and determined that sex was the primary motivator of behavior and that repression of sexual desires manifests as negative psychological phenomenon. And that's a theory that might not surprise people cocaine-inspired. Jung, on the other hand, was fueled by psychedelics and expressed concepts of synchronicity, telepathy, archetypal phenomena, and the collective unconscious. He wrote a book called Liber Novus, the Red Book, which remained unpublished until after his death. It is full of visionary imagery and describes his communication with entities he calls angels and demons. It was his personal study into the mind that he thought was too controversial to publish alongside his mainstream scientific work. He often considered if he was having a schizophrenia. One can only imagine the differences in the world that would have embraced Jung as the father of psychology, rather than our current one who embraced Freud as such. A true Jedi wields both sides of the Force, or rather, a true Jedi of the light will have already descended into darkness and conquered it. This is the metaphor behind the concept of catabasis, which is the hero's descent into the underworld, and is a universal philosophical and spiritual concept. The descent into the underworld, or darkness, or madness, is essential for our understanding of it. But our ascension back to the surface is paramount to complete the enlightening process. For 2,000 years in ancient Greece, there was a yearly initiation into the esoteric awareness behind these myths. It was called the Eleusinian Mysteries. Anyone in the world could attend, either kings or slaves, and everyone was expected to make the pilgrimage at least once in their life. Initiates were promised some sort of personal survival after death in an everlasting life of happiness. It was a psychedelic initiation that used the myth of Persephone's descent into the underworld and eventual ascension and reunification with her mother as the framework for the psychedelic process, much in the same way that Tim Leary and Ram Dass used the Book of the Dead. Initiates would consume a drink called kekion and behold the mysteries. They were not being taught a doctrine or worldview. They were being given an experience of contact with the divine. This reveals the true value of myths as a roadmap to help us understand ineffable spiritual experience, and not stories that are true or false. Now, I'm sure some of you are commenting how the psychedelic component of the Eleusinian Mysteries is only a theory, so let's hear about the mysteries from the mouths of those who actually experienced them, and who became the fathers of Western philosophy and mathematics, and quickly point out that this is Persephone holding a mushroom. Plato, who was an initiate of the mysteries, mentioned it in his dialogue on the immortality of the soul called the Phaedo, saying, "Our mysteries had a very real meaning. He that has been purified and initiated shall dwell with the gods." According to Plato, the ultimate design of the mysteries was to lead us back to the principles from which we descended. This is to a perfect enjoyment of intellectual or spiritual good. In another of Plato's works, a prophetess says to Socrates, "As for the purpose of these rites, when they are done correctly, that is the final and highest mystery." Aristotle said that the initiates did not learn, but experienced the mysteries, and were brought to an appropriate state of mind.